My name is Mary Beth. I'll be your service leader for today. I'm so happy to have you. I love seeing our shirts. If you guys didn't notice, there's quite a few of us wearing them today. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Laura and Ed, for organizing it all, and for Claire Helton for designing them. They're super lovely. So just in the spirit of our church, I'd like for you to turn to your neighbor and just say, hey, you belong. You belong. Okay, now that we all know that we belong, and hopefully you know that you belong here, because you do. This is the one place where we can all let our freak flags fly and love each other. This is your home. Welcome. And I'm going to have some opening words here, and I'll ask Joe if he can help me light the chalice. And this is a participation, so I'll read the normal writing, and then I'll have you guys read the italicized writing. And our reading is by Wendy Bartle. Hopefully y'all can see that there. It says, "We who dwell on the margins know about divisions, arbitrary and intentional, like land, like class, like culture.
We make our borders around pieces of ourselves, and we blur the edges by being who we are, by staying in the circle."
Beyond binaries, we multiply possibilities, languages, customs, practices, rituals, and ceremonies. Not one narrative, but stories shared.
Separation is illusion. Love transgresses borders between you, me, us, them, between secular and sacred.
We need trust to strengthen our connection. We must dare to cross from my world into yours, from your world into mine, until we begin to weave a tapestry of faith and wonder aloud. Thank you. And if you're willing and able to stand with me, and we will say our covenant. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Thank you. If you'll remain standing, we're going to have our opening hymn, if the choir will come, and it's going to be in this dark gray hymnal, page 121, "We'll Build a Land."
All morning, oh, we'll
going to invite the choir up at this time. We're doing a special for offertory, and as they come, will y'all help me sing the children out? Go now in peace, go now in peace, may the spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Thank you, that was lovely. So this time is our offertory, and we have some information up here on the screen. So for those of you who are new, or those of you who have forgotten, we are a community solely responsible for ourselves, basically. So anything that you can give, time, talent, or treasure is greatly appreciated. At this time, if you have some treasure you would like to share with us, we'd greatly appreciate it. We'll have our ushers pass around a basket, while the choir, and led by Mike, sings Come On Out, which is a song that they wrote, Mike and Rivka wrote for us. Aren't we blessed to have such talented people in our congregation? Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, a friend of mine, Joe Vinson. He is a digital media coordinator, a local historian, and starting tomorrow, our very own president of the UUCP board. Please help me welcome him.
Good morning, everyone. All right. Today I'm going to be talking about the sixth principle, which is a little ironic because Claire originally asked me to give a service about the UUA principles, and I said, no thanks, I'd rather talk about something else. But I didn't know exactly what then, but that's how this kind of came together. The 7 principles, or 8, as our congregation and many others observe, are the things that we as UUs hold as strong values and moral guides. They are the things we affirm and promote. In the 6th principle, we affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Of course, words can mean lots of different things in different contexts, and I'll get to the different meanings of peace, liberty, and justice in a bit. But first, I want to talk about a word that we may not think of as having multiple definitions. That word is we, the subject that is doing the action of affirming and promoting. But we all know what we means, right? It's the first person plural pronoun. It's us. Would that it were so simple. In linguistics, there's a concept called clusivity, that there is both an inclusive we and an exclusive we. It has to do with the speaker's relationship with the addressee. For example, let's say you're an employee at a company and your supervisor tells you, we're getting bonuses this year because we surpassed our annual sales goals. That's an inclusive we. It includes the speaker, and the addressee, and possibly others at the company. Now let's imagine a similar conversation, but the supervisor says, unfortunately, we've decided to eliminate your position because we're too optimistic about our sales goals. That's an exclusive we. It's referring to the speaker and some others in the company, but specifically not the addressee. Sometimes the meaning of we can turn on a dime. Consider another scenario. If two parents are talking to their child and one parent says, we have a surprise for you, we're going to Disney World. The first we is exclusive because it refers to the parent, not the child. Hopefully the second we has switched to be inclusive because it would seem cruel otherwise. We're going to Disney World, not you though, we'll be back in a week. There's SpaghettiOs in the pantry, don't burn the house down. So you can see how this is a very important distinction. Yet in English, we use the same word to represent both. Many Austronesian, Austroasiatic, Dravidian, Algonquian languages, and others have different words or constructions to denote clusivity, but most Indo-European languages rely only on context clues. So I want to think about those three concepts from the 6 principles, peace, liberty, and justice, in terms of clusivity. Whose perspective is being represented? When we say for all, do we mean it? Who is included? Who is excluded? And what if one of these conflicts with another one? So let's start with liberty, aka freedom. What does liberty mean? One definition is the power to do as one pleases, which sounds pretty good, right? But again, under the surface, we have lots of different potential meanings. In 1958, political theorist and philosopher Isaiah Berlin introduced the concept of positive liberty and negative liberty. Negative liberty, he said, is the absence of constraints or obstacles. Positive liberty is the presence of self-determination and self-realization. In simplified terms, negative liberty is freedom from, positive liberty is freedom to, though I would argue that the freedom from want, portrayed here by Norman Rockwell as one of the 4 freedoms of the Roosevelt administration, is an example of positive liberty. Positive liberty you can think of as entitlements. Like the clusivity of we, the difference is relative to the observer or agent. Politically, governments have focused on terms of negative liberty because that's what involves limitations of the state's power, an external agent. And this tends to be what we think of as libertarianism. The government shouldn't tell me what I can or can't do. And that's all well and good, but on its own, negative liberty has finite utility. Its real-world impact is dependent on other power dynamics, right? Many of the founders of this country were wealthy plantation owners who had very lofty ideas about negative liberty, don't tread on me and all that, but those ideas were never extended to the enslaved people or to women. Think about the clusivity of the we in We the People. After the Civil War, more people started to interrogate what freedom means. Newly emancipated black people were coming to terms with no money, no land, and in the face of draconian black codes and vagrancy laws, many were being pressured into labor contracts and living situations that were scarcely different from slavery, often reliant on the same people who previously enslaved them. There's an entire era of judicial jurisprudence where we had the liberty to contract. Ohio Congressman and future President James Garfield asked in 1865, "What is freedom? Is it the bare privilege of not being chained? If this is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery, a cruel delusion." In a 1943 essay about the freedom from want, Filipino-American Carlos Bulosan wrote of the experience of migrant laborers, quote, "We are not really free unless we use what we produce. So long as the fruit of our labor is denied us, so long will want manifest itself in a world of slaves. It is only when we have plenty to eat, plenty of everything, that we begin to understand what freedom means." Angela Davis said, quote, "The idea of freedom is inspiring, but what does it mean? If you are free in a political sense but have no food, what's that? The freedom to starve?" Positive liberty is not just different from negative liberty. Sometimes they are mutually exclusive. Consider a white restaurant owner who doesn't want to serve black people. This would be illegal now under Title II of the Civil Rights Act. The restaurant owner might say that such a law is a violation of his liberty, that the government shouldn't be able to tell him who he can and can't serve. But positive liberty requires equal service and public accommodations, an entitlement to be treated like other customers regardless of race. Or consider a pharmacist who says it would violate their religious liberty to fulfill a prescription for birth control. Or a county clerk who says it would violate their religious liberty to sign a gay couple's marriage certificate. Does their negative liberty outweigh the positive liberty of the people denied service? Or, let's say, there's a global pandemic of a novel airborne virus that is killing millions of people, and the government says you need to wear a face mask on an airplane, or you need to present evidence that you've been vaccinated to participate in certain group activities. The negative liberty view of this is that it violates our freedom. We shouldn't be forced to do this. The positive liberty view thinks about the immunocompromised people who are especially vulnerable to this disease and who depend on group precautions. So for these and many other reasons, let's consider whether or not we're thinking of negative liberty or positive liberty. Next, let's look at justice. As a concept, justice is very nebulous. It's moral rightness, it's fairness, it's the act of being just. It's a tautology. In practice, justice is enacted through laws. We have prescripted consequences for proscripted activities. We often define justice by the intention of these consequences. Punitive or retributive justice comes from an intent of punishing the wrongdoer for the sake of punishment. Utilitarian justice can come from an intent to limit someone's capacity to cause harm or as a deterrent for potential future wrongdoing. Restorative justice comes from an intent of repairing the harm that was done and rehabilitating the wrongdoer. But our application of justice always flows from the law as a starting point, and legality is a poor measure of morality. Slavery, let's remember, was legal. Here in Pensacola, in 1844, an abolitionist named Jonathan Walker helped 7 people escape enslavement. When apprehended, he was convicted of slave stealing and branded on his hand with SS. That was the law, but today we can recognize that it was not justice. In theory, justice is synonymous with fairness and egalitarianism, an equal application of the law. But like freedom, the effective meaning of justice hinges on inclusivity. Who is included in the we? As Anatole France quipped in 1894, in its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread. The rich can't do it just as much as the poor can't do it. You might be familiar with a recent aphorism that has become known as Will Hoyt's Law, which says that liberalism is not a formal political philosophy, but rather just a response to conservatism, and that conservatism consists of exactly one proposition, to wit, there must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. We can see this in action when powerful people subvert the tools of justice to benefit members of their in-group or to target and punish members of out-groups. For examples of this, I could refer you to the entirety of human history, but I'll offer a few recent cases. You may remember that in 2018, Florida voters passed Amendment 4, a constitutional amendment that automatically restores the voting rights of Floridians with most felony convictions after they complete all terms of their sentence, including parole or probation. By enshrining it in the state constitution, the intent was to change Florida's status as the, quote, disenfranchisement capital of America by bypassing the lengthy and capricious process that gave full discretion to the governor's clemency board, which, in former Governor Rick Scott's own words, had, quote, absolutely no standards. Scott's clemency board restored on average only about 1% of the applicant's rights compared to his predecessor, Charlie Crist. After the amendment passed by a nearly 2-to-1 margin, the Florida legislature and new Governor Ron DeSantis passed a law that added a requirement for qualifying felons to pay, quote, all fines and fees associated with their sentence before the rights were restored, which effectively disenfranchised 750,000 Floridians with felony records. After adding this new layer of scrutiny and uncertainty that was clearly not intended by the voters in the 2018 amendment, DeSantis launched an aggressive crackdown on former felons who cast ballots in 2020 without having their rights restored. In many cases, these people were handcuffed at gunpoint without them understanding why they were being arrested. It came out later that many of them had requested and been given voter registration cards by state officials. They believed that they were legally voting, so they did. So those are the out-groups. On the in-group side, consider a man who was recently convicted by a New York jury on 34 felony counts. since he now lives and votes in Florida, this raises the question of whether he would be allowed to vote in the upcoming November election. However, Governor DeSantis posted on social media, given the absurd nature of the New York prosecution of this man, this would be an easy case to qualify for restoration of rights per the Florida Clemency Board, which I chair. The bottom line is that Donald Trump's vote this November will be one of millions that demonstrate Florida is now a solid Republican state. So we are not going to see armed police kicking down the doors of Mar-a-Lago and dragging the president out in his underwear. The inclusivity of justice depends on the observer. As George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. So finally, let's think about the definition of peace. Peace is a state of tranquility or quiet, but again, we need to identify the parties. Peace between nations is one thing, the absence of war. We talk about inner peace, calmness within one's own mind. There can be peace between neighbors or family members, interpersonal harmony, peace within a community, freedom from civil disturbance, a state of security or order. The Hebrew Bible offers an evocative vision of what a peaceful existence would look like in the kingdom of God to come. From the prophet Micah, quote, "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken." That last part is repeated in 1 Kings and Zechariah, and you might be humming the song from Hamilton in your head for one last time where George Washington sings, "I want to sit under my own vine and fig tree, a moment alone in the shade, at home in this nation we've made." It was one of Washington's favorite phrases and representative of the agrarian ideal that was common among the founders, that of the 4 stages of Adam Smith's stadial theory, that the third stage, agriculture, was the best, purest. America would be full of virtuous yeoman farmers who would be self-sufficient and free from oppression and foreign entanglements. But it also represented the idea that marginalized people could live in this new country free from prejudice and discrimination. As Washington wrote to the Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, quote, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." But of course, Washington's fondness for scripture was a bit myopic. His definition of everyone did not include the millions of African slaves whose labor enriched all those idyllic white farmers, including the hundreds of slaves at Washington's own Mount Vernon. Exclusive versus inclusive peace. Is peace a negative right, the absence of conflict, or a positive entitlement? We have another word for the exclusive, negative meaning of peace, and it's order. And if you start thinking of justice and peace by the more exclusive phrasing, law and order, it's easy to see how they hinge greatly on whose interests are being represented and protected. The phrase law and order became popularized in 1968 against the backdrop of civil rights protests and riots, and it helped Richard Nixon win the presidential election. A year earlier, Miami Police Chief Walter Headley coined the phrase, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Both phrases were used to reflect a certain position, even though they are, in my mind, obviously in conflict. If you are in a society of law and order, you don't get to inflict capital punishment on people suspected of a crime without due process. And we've recently seen both of these phrases return to popularity, in part because of protest movements like Black Lives Matter. And that's no coincidence. Because devotion to law and order depends on who is wielding the law and order, who is the in-group and who is the out-group. According to the Thurgood Marshall Institute, when police are present at racial justice protests, they use projectiles and chemical weapons 19.4% of the time, compared to 2.4% of the time at non-racial justice protests. This brings me to the recent student protests about the violence in Gaza, and I'll tip my hand here to reveal that this was my impetus for writing the service. Because I'm guessing that a fairly liberal-minded audience of UUs has mostly been nodding along in agreement to what I've said so far, and I want to get a little more challenging. These protests erupted across college campuses this spring because we've all witnessed the collective punishment inflicted on the Palestinian people in Gaza in response to the October 7 Hamas attack. a response that has killed tens of thousands of civilians and children, that has destroyed most of the homes and infrastructure of the 2 million Gazans who already lived in conditions likened to an open-air prison, and that threatens to become the largest man-made famine since World War II. Many Americans feel complicit in this violence because our government provides money and weapons to Israel. Many students feel complicit because their universities are heavily invested in Israeli corporations and weapon manufacturers. So, some of the student groups demand divestment from these companies. Discourse about these protests is fraught because some people perceive any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And to be sure, there has been a troubling rise of anti-Semitism in the US before October 7 because of a resurgent white nationalist movement, and after October 7 because many people have internalized the idea that Israel represents Judaism. But the fact is that Jewish students, through groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, played a major role in these protests, often overrepresented compared to the Jewish populations of the school itself. While the overwhelming majority of these protests were peaceful and well organized, news coverage and political pundits often focused on slogans that many find offensive, like From the River to the Sea or Globalize the Intifada, as well as deliberately inflammatory phrases shouted by agents provocateurs, focused on attacks perpetrated by counter-protesters or on the violent arrests by police as evidence that these protests were disorderly. Many people, even those who had previously been generally supportive, turned against the student protests when a group of Columbia University students broke into an academic building, Hamilton Hall, and occupied it. They renamed it Heinz Hall, after a young Palestinian girl killed by the IDF. The smashing of some windows was broadcast on cable news and used to justify a militarized response by NYPD later that day. President Biden gave a statement in the aftermath in which he said, quote, "Dissent is essential for democracy, but dissent must never lead to disorder." Mustn't it? Just as Will Hoyt's law defines liberalism as a form of anti-conservatism, maybe you've heard this definition before. A conservative is just a liberal who's been mugged. Or another bon mot, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. For those who have played the Secret Hitler game, might sound familiar. A lot of liberal-minded people are supportive of protest movements and progressive causes until it impacts them personally, until it blocks their commute, makes them late for work, until there's shouting or foul language, until there's property damage or graffiti. Then an over-the-top police response is justified. Then we need to rethink the strategy. Then we need to focus on the right way to protest. But what is the right way to protest? Is it limited to people quietly holding signs in a prescribed place for a prescribed duration of time? That would be great news for authoritarians, because a protest that can be easily ignored will never threaten the status quo. What's the difference between a bad protest and a good protest? Does anyone know? It's about 20 years. Just give it a generation or so. There's a saying often misattributed to Gandhi that goes, quote, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win." It's actually a paraphrase of a 1918 speech by labor activist Nicholas Klein, who said, "First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, and then they attack you and want to burn you, and then they build monuments to you." And there are a lot of monuments to protesters we now consider righteous, who at the time were condemned by wide majorities for their disorderly tactics. That building at Columbia, Hamilton Hall, has been occupied by several previous protest movements, and these were not peaceful, orderly demonstrations. In 1968, occupiers renamed it the Malcolm X Liberation College, trapped a dean in his office. When it was cleared by police, not later in the day, but 3 weeks later, 700 people were arrested, 100 were injured, many of them severely injured. In 1985, anti-apartheid protesters named it Mandela Hall and blockaded themselves, demanding and eventually winning the university's complete divestment from South Africa. Yet from the safety of the present, the Columbia University website proudly brags about its legacy of student activism, listing these events under, quote, "Columbia History and Traditions." A few years ago, we visited the Alcatraz prison in San Francisco, where they had an exhibit about the 19-month occupation of the island by the Red Power group, Indians of all tribes. The National Parks exhibit was very sympathetic to the occupiers, but that certainly was not the position of the US government at the time. Today, Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most revered figures in American history. According to Pew Research, 94% of Americans had a favorable opinion of him in 2011, compared to 4% unfavorable. But in 1966, shortly after the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, 2 years before his assassination, only 33% of Americans viewed him favorably, 63% had an unfavorable opinion, and 44% had a highly unfavorable position. One contemporary political cartoon from the Birmingham News mocked Dr. King's movement, showing him against a background of a destroyed city and telling a reporter, quote, "I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow." In Dr. King's famous 1963 letter from the Birmingham jail, he wrote, quote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action.'" Or take Nelson Mandela, who spent decades in prison for his campaigns of sabotage against the South African apartheid government. He was finally released from prison in 1990, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, and served as the first black president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. Do you know when the United States officially removed him from our terror watch list? 2008. Mandela wrote in his book, A Long Walk to Freedom, quote, "For me, nonviolence was not a moral principle but a strategy. There is no moral goodness in using an ineffective weapon. Over and over again, we had used all the nonviolent weapons in our arsenal, all to no avail, for whatever we did was met by an iron hand. At a certain point, one can only fight fire with fire." As Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, said, quote, "In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience." Here's another example that I'm guessing you have mixed feelings about, because I do too. Recently, some climate activists from the group Just Stop Oil sprayed Stonehenge with an orange substance and demanded that the British government phase out fossil fuels by 2030. While the substance was later revealed to be a water-soluble cornstarch powder, Stonehenge is not only a cultural landmark but a sacred site, and many people were very upset. This same group has also thrown soup at paintings, glued themselves to frames in galleries, smeared cake on a wax figure of King Charles, spray painted a number of department stores and car showrooms, and disrupted West End shows with protests. Maybe you've seen these news stories and thought, well, that's just stupid, or that's counterproductive to the movement, or what did Van Gogh do to deserve this? And I get it. If I had paid a bunch of money to see Les Miserables, yeah, I'd probably be upset at the disruption. It's much easier to sympathize with the fictionalized protesters on the barricade than to reckon with the real-life kind. But these protests are modeled after similar resistance actions by British suffragettes who smashed windows and slashed paintings in the 1910s. I bet a lot of people back then thought that they were counterproductive as well, but hey, women got the vote just a few years after that. Massive resistance is usually effective. And remember that these actions are never the first step. Nobody starts with throwing soup, step one. We've known about the existential dangers of climate change for decades. Most of my life, we've been talking about it, with basically nothing to show for it in terms of meaningful policy changes to try to avert catastrophe. Millions of lives are at stake according to scientific studies and projections, and there is no time to lose. Protests like these are a primal scream. One of the students arrested for the Les Mis protest said, quote, "I don't want to be disrupting people's evenings out, but I've been left with no other choice. Our government is betraying the young and putting everyone's futures on the line. I'm doing this because I'm desperate." Sometimes the pursuit of justice is at odds with the pursuit of order. Sometimes the status quo inflicts a violence that can justify violence in response. Just like the law, order itself doesn't have any inherent goodness or morality, and just like the law, order tends to protect in-groups and bind out-groups. After many Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 stopped traffic, several states introduced legislation that would make it legal for motorists to strike and potentially kill pedestrians who are blocking an intersection. In Texas, a man who was convicted by a jury of murdering a BLM protester was recently pardoned by Governor Greg Abbott. Murder is okay if you're a member of the in-group and your victim was a member of the out-group. The fact is, as far as institutions of power are concerned, there's never a right way to protest. Defenders of the status quo will fight you tooth and nail, even if you are quietly kneeling during a song. As we end Pride Month, let's remember that Pride started at Stonewall with bricks and beer cans being thrown at police officers. And let's not kid ourselves. If it happened today, every member of Congress and political pundit across the spectrum would line up to condemn it. Later this week, we will celebrate our nation's independence, which was not achieved through a peaceful gathering of people holding signs. General Washington's visions of peace sitting under his own vine and fig tree was predicated on a war of revolution. But that naturally raises the question, how can you tell John Lewis's good trouble from the bad kind? What's the fundamental difference between a BLM protest and a January 6th? We all want to be on the right side of history, but we're not time travelers. We can't claim to know what history will judge us for. Some people have suggested that the moral arc of the universe is best predicted by young people, which is partly true. But, sorry, I skipped one, didn't I? These were young people. These were young people. These kids in Pensacola were young people. So instead, I would say that we should trust movements and coalitions that are diverse and inclusive. Last year, Dr. Lauren Anzaldo led a trio of services about our church's mission, which is to celebrate diversity, strive for justice, and inspire love. To explain the relationship between these things, she offered a forest ecosystem metaphor that I've thought a lot about since then. Diversity and inclusion are at the heart of the ecosystem, the ground and the air. Love and empathy are the sustenance, the water, and the nutrients. And it's in this kind of environment that justice and equity have what they need to grow. They're the trees. I'd like to add one more layer to this metaphor. Peace is the fruit that springs from the trees of justice. It's a little treat we get as a reward for growing a just and equitable society. In other words, no justice, no peace. Dang, guys, I realized I could have made this service a lot shorter. As Jesus said, you will know them by their fruits. If you have an environment that chokes out justice, you won't end up with fruits of peace. You might be able to grow trees of law, which have an outwardly similar fruit called order. But these trees don't last because they have shallow roots that are prone to rotting, and the fruit is seedless and cannot propagate itself. But if we plant trees of inclusive, positive justice, to quote our own Charlotte Crane's poem, a postscript, peace will come later or sooner. In the meantime, let's make our circles more inclusive. When we talk about liberty, peace, and justice for all, let's honestly interrogate who it is we're including and who might be excluded. And knowing that progress doesn't happen without a struggle, let's honor the radical difference makers of the past by keeping an open mind to the radical struggles of today. I would rather live in a disordered world seeking justice than in an unjust world seeking order. Thank you. Our closing song is another original by Mike and Rivka.
Pride and arrogance are not the same. Are not the same. Pride and arrogance are not the same. Pride and arrogance are not the same. land. Enough, enough. Humiliation, enough, enough. Interrogation, enough, enough. Degradation, enough, enough. Incarceration, enough, enough. Finding who you are is hard enough, enough. Without trying to hide it well enough, enough. To show a crooked world you're straight enough, enough. To meet its double standards, enough, enough. We became a hurricane, enough, enough. Nothing anyone had planned, enough, enough. We've taken all that we could stand, enough, enough. She felt a brick leaving her hand, enough, enough. When I say enough, you say enough, enough. When I scream enough, you scream enough, enough.
All right, our closing words are by Rosemary Brea McNatt. This is also responsive. Please read the parts in bold and italics. The truth is this: if here is no justice, there will be no peace.
If we cannot bring justice into the small circles of our individual lives, we cannot hope to bring justice to the world.
And if we do not bring justice to the world, none of us is safe and none of us will survive.
Nothing that we do is more important than making justice real, here, where we are.
Hard as diversity is, it is our most important task. Thank you. Go in peace.